Sunday's Indianapolis 500 on NBC averaged 5.3 million viewers and peaked at over 6 million towards the end of the race, up a whopping 8% over 2023. Now, that increase can most likely be traced to the Kyle Larson effect, combined with a late decision to lift the local Indianapolis broadcast of the blackout after the rain delay. A true TV rating increase of any kind has been desperately needed in IndyCar this year, after the first few races of the season were down significantly across the board until thankfully this May, the GP, qualifying, and race all saw a ratings increase. Unfortunately, I foresee a major drop coming when the Indy cars take to the track this weekend in Detroit. Last year's race got a decent 1 million viewers on NBC, but this year's race returns to the USA Network, where in 2022 it scored an absolutely dismal 300,000 viewers. But why? Why does this happen? Where do over 5 million people go in just a single week? I've got a few thoughts, and I'll try to articulate them as best as I can. Now, here's my background. I have been attending the Indianapolis 500 since 2002. I've been a lifelong IndyCar fan, and I've been covering the sport at the racetrack consistently since the year of 2022. So I've seen a lot of different facets of IndyCar. I've seen it from a lot of different angles, and I can hopefully provide a little bit of perspective as to why the rest of the series doesn't get the attention that the Indy 500 does, because it's something that's puzzled me for the longest time. I can't imagine how much it's puzzled people who maybe, aren't as invested or aren't as dedicated to this thing year round, but they see the TV ratings and they go, well, that doesn't make any sense. I'll try to make sense of it in this video. So throughout the years, especially the Indy 500s I've attended, the way the race is promoted, the way the race is hyped up has changed significantly over the course of time that I've been going to it. In 2002, the Indy 500 was very much the Super Bowl of auto racing. You had two series, the Indy Racing League, which actually ran the Indianapolis 500, and CART, Championship Auto Racing Teams, where much of the big teams and manufacturers and drivers were. Well, they all kind of converged for a 3 or 4 year period despite running separate series, and they did it at the Indianapolis 500. So you'd have big entry lists with lots of teams, lots of drivers, exciting drivers, two champions going up against each other from the two different series. The race mattered. The race was promoted. The race cars were cool. The race cars were different. There were a lot of cars bumping in and out of the field. Speeds were increasing from where they had been at the beginning of the IRL era. There was a lot of talk about the race. The race was what was promoted. The race was what was exciting. The drivers that you didn't get to see all year doing battle with one another was exciting. That was the driving force behind the Indianapolis 500 when I started going. It was a bit of a residual effect of the boom of the 1990s. It was all about the stars of the past coming back and doing battle with the drivers who had been there for a couple of years. Really compelling time, politics aside. But things began to change as the kart teams fully came over to the Indy Racing League and pushed out, kind of history repeating itself, pushed out a lot of the small teams and the fun stories. And ultimately, in the very next year, 2003, there wasn't even a bump day. They had to scramble to fill the field. That began to drive the hype down. The race didn't matter as much because it was the same guys you saw the whole year long racing at the 500, and they were the only ones with a chance to win. The technology was still there. There were still different chassis and engines. In fact, Toyota and Honda returned to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. In fact, Toyota, the first time they had been at the 500 in 2003. But things continued to decline, although the 500 in the Super Bowl era was still, I think, quite compelling and had many compelling stories. There was a growing concern about the merger. When was this going to happen? When were Champ Car and the IRL finally going to get together? And they did in 2008. And there was a lot of hype around that. In fact, a huge crowd showed up in 2008 to see the first merged Indy 500. I think a lot of people had a lot of positivity towards that. Then the economy crashed, and the IndyCar series began to get quite stagnant. The change that everybody had been hoping for when the two series merged never came. It did eventually come, though, in 2012. The problem was the new car didn't really meet the expectations that everyone had in 2008. Yes, the racing was exciting, but it didn't look or sound like the past. It didn't look or sound like the things that people kind of expected or wanted IndyCar to be since 1995. So you began to see more and more of a dip as more and more of the hardcore racing fans began to leave the Indianapolis 500. In fact, if you look at the crowd in 2013, and there were other factors like the Boston Marathon bombing was a big one, but the crowd in 2013 was one of the worst ever. It's one of the most competitive races ever, 68 lead changes, but the crowd wasn't there. And IMS and IndyCar realized this. So in 2014, there was a massive change I noticed in the marketing towards the Indianapolis 500. It was less about the cars and the teams and the drivers and the stories there, the history. It was about the party. The snake pit came back. The GP became a thing. There were a lot of things aimed at not necessarily talking about the race anymore, but it was talking about you want to be at the race because you don't want to miss this party. And it worked. 2014, 2015, 2016, of course, the greatest party of all, the 100th running of the Indianapolis 500, which was a sellout. It was a great success. This marketing worked. And it's worked all the way up until this day. In fact, post 2020, the Indianapolis 500, promoting the party aspect of it, promoting the happening aspect of it, was essentially a sellout this year. I think there was like 5,000 seats they didn't sell. And in a capacity crowd of like 400 to 450,000, 5,000 doesn't make much of a difference whether it's a sellout or not. I can tell you that that place was freaking packed, even with a 4-hour rain delay. And I think that's a credit to IMS and Doug Bowles and his leadership. He took over there around 2014, and he does a hell of a job promoting with what he's got, what he's given by the IndyCar series. They've realized at IMS that to get people in the door, they have to create this festival atmosphere. And they've done that. But it does create a bit of a false positive for the series when you have this every year you have a near sellout crowd and you have 6 million people watching on TV. And you get to Detroit and best case scenario, you've lost 4/5 of the audience. Worst case scenario, you've lost significantly more. And it's something that I've struggled with quite a bit because it just doesn't seem to make sense when you're like, well, where did all these people go? Especially, they didn't watch the GP and they didn't watch Detroit, but they watch the Indianapolis 500 and some of them watch qualifying. But that false positive was put into perspective a little bit last year when I attended the sister race to the Indianapolis 500, the 24 Hours of Le Mans. A lot of things began to click for me when I attended that race, and I had a better understanding of what the Indianapolis 500 is now and how the IndyCar series surrounding the Indy 500 has changed over the years. The Indy 500 is kind of adapted, and I think the IndyCar series either has regressed or hasn't adapted to the times. I feel like, again, I didn't get to attend the golden era of the Indy 500. I wasn't there in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right? I started coming in 2002. But when I went to the 24 Hours of Le Mans, I got the distinct impression that I had been to a race that felt the way the Indianapolis 500 did in 1994. There were a ton of racing fans there. People came to this race from all over the world because they were there to see a race. The manufacturers were engaged about showing off their new technology, their new cars. They were excited. They were handing out flags, banners, posters. Those were for sale too. You could buy all sorts of stuff, not only from your favorite drivers, but your favorite teams everywhere. This race, you couldn't get away from it. You went in the grocery stores and you could buy comic books. And I did buy lots of comic books about the history of the race. Model cars everywhere. You couldn't get away from the 24 Hours of Le Mans. People were there for the race. The majority of them anyway. I'm willing to say that the 24 Hours of Le Mans is a race that a party happens to happen at. And the Indy 500 is a party that the race happens to happen at. Neither of those are necessarily the wrong way to go about things. They both get amazing crowds. But one of those is sustainable long-term in terms of a full series, and the other one is sustainable for one race. I would go as far as to say, and this will make sense in a second why I'm going off of a statistic, 70% of statistics are made up on the spot, right? But you'll understand here in a second. I would say that when I went to Le Mans, 70% of the crowd was there for the race, and 30% of them were there for the happening and for the party and for the excitement. Trust me, I went in the Porsche curves at about 5 o'clock in the morning at Le Mans. You could stack the beer cans to the heavens. There's a lot of partying that goes on at Le Mans. Do not get me wrong, but I got the impression that the majority of the people there were there for the race. You don't see people in the grandstands at the Indianapolis 500 pawing through the pages of race car engineering. You just don't see that. Maybe you did in the past. I suspect you did in the past, but you don't anymore. And I think Indy's almost the exact opposite of Le Mans in terms of crowd makeup. 70% of the people are there for the party, for the happening, for the, getting drunk and running on top of the porta-johns. Shout out to Dale Tanhart for getting that video. That was incredible. And 30% of them are hardcore racing fans, whether they're IndyCar fans or fans from outside of the IndyCar bubble, coming there to see the Indianapolis 500 because they believe it's the greatest race in the world. And that's the contrast. That's where things are different, and that's why there's a disconnect between the 500 and the series. Now, I've attended most of the IndyCar races on the calendar over the last 3 years of my life. And the only race that comes remotely close to the feeling of that party atmosphere, of that drama, of that excitement that the Indianapolis 500 has is Long Beach. It's no surprise that Long Beach is the second biggest race in the IndyCar series. It's the second biggest and most attended race, and it's the one that the drivers all say that they want to win the most. That's not surprising. I would put Iowa at a very, very distant third behind the Indy 500 and Long Beach, and St. Pete probably around there with Iowa as well. There's a big crowd. But again, it's kind of like the Indy 500 thing. It's a very party atmosphere. It's not necessarily a lot of race fans. When IndyCar isn't on the IMS Oval, and here's where things get a little bit tricky, because when we talk about the false positives and we talk about kind of the demographic of the crowd, you have a massive 400,000 person crowd. But the 70% that are there for the party, they might pay a little bit of attention to the race. There's no doubt about it. They could probably name 5, 6, 7, 8 drivers. They probably cheered when Pato O'Ward took the lead. They probably were shocked and awed when Joseph Newgarden took the lead. But at the end of the day, roughly 70% of the crowd has already forgotten about IndyCar. They've already forgotten about the Indianapolis 500. They didn't know Detroit was happening this weekend. They've gone on to greener pastures. They're going to think about the Colts, the Pacers, frat parties, pickleball, you name it. They're thinking about that for the next 364 days of the year. They will not know or care or watch Detroit. They're gone. So what you're left with is 30%. And if you look at the TV audience, let's say the TV audience is made up by about the same amount of percentage that the race attendees are. You have a pretty sizable audience still of about 2 million people that you can play with who are watching that race because they want to watch a race. They're not just watching out of tradition or watching because it's a Memorial Day happening. They're watching because of a race. But I would say that those 30% of true race fans that are at the Indianapolis 500, you could split by a further 50%. I think that about half of the true race fans that attend the Indianapolis 500 don't really pay attention to the rest of this IndyCar season. That would be about 15% of the total audience. And if you look at the increase of the television numbers, about half of that probably accounts for Kyle Larson. Do you really think a lot of the people who are sprint car people or NASCAR people who are tuning in for Kyle Larson are going to tune in for another IndyCar race the rest of the year? It would be cool if they did, but I just don't think that's realistic. What you're left with then is the 15% that are hardcore IndyCar fans. And that's what you've got for the entirety of the season. So why does that other 15% of IndyCar, adjacent fans, ones who are essentially 500 only, but are racing fans the rest of the year, tune in for the Indy 500? I think there's a lot of factors, but I think there's two really, really big ones. Number one, the Indy 500 is unique not only in racing, but unfortunately it's unique in the IndyCar series itself. No other race operates the same way the Indy 500 does. There are no guaranteed spots. The guy who won the race 2 years ago damn near missed out on the field because he crashed in practice. No IndyCar race or any other race on the motorsports calendar is like that. There is not that kind of drama. There's no prestige like that to get into a 33 car field in racing. None. It doesn't exist. The other thing that no other series, including IndyCar now, does any other time of the year than the Indianapolis 500 is the 220 mile per hour wheel-to-wheel racing for over 3.5 hours. That is one of the coolest things in sport, period. It makes total sense because you can't get that in IMSA. You cannot get that in Formula One. You cannot get that in NASCAR. The only place that it takes place is the Indianapolis 500. Unfortunately, you can't even get it in IndyCar anymore. We hope that Nashville will be something like that, resembling that, but that is yet to be seen. I'm looking forward to covering that race because of that fact. But as of right now, the Indy 500 is the only race that looks or resembles the Indianapolis 500 in IndyCar racing. There's real risk. There's real stakes. It's important, and it's different than any other motorsport in the world. It's incredible drama. It's only done once a year, though, and those hardcore racing fans know this. They're not going to tune into Detroit expecting to see the Indianapolis 500. It's a street course. The speeds range between 60 to 160 miles per hour. Street racing, I love street racing. I love St. Pete, love Long Beach. I don't want to see these races go away. But at the end of the day, IndyCar is in a very competitive market in terms of street racing. You can go see a street race with sports cars. Formula E, Formula One, touring cars. There's a whole bunch. NASCAR now street races. They all do it. You can, if something scratches the itch better for you as a racing fan, you might choose another series over IndyCar to watch a race, especially on a street course. I think a lot of different racing series are more attractive than IndyCar when it's a regular season race. Many other series have different technology. They're louder cars. There's different sounds. They look different. All of these things do matter to the hardcore racing fan. And while there might be a minority of the Indy 500 TV audience and a minority of the crowd that attends that race, I think they're a majority, or could be a majority, the rest of the season. And oftentimes, I think their needs are ignored, or at least not thought of as particularly important. When you cut the race fan aspect in half, you get to Detroit and you have about 15% of the Indianapolis 500 audience. That would be what I would consider to be the real numbers of the IndyCar fan base. And since I would say 6 million is about a nice round number of the people that probably watch the Indy 500, let's say for an hour, 30 minutes to an hour, which, let's be fair to some people. Maybe they were at a picnic, maybe they were at church, they had to miss the beginning of the race, but they were locked in for a significant enough portion of the race that they watched it and were engaged with it. I think 6 million is the right number for that. 15% of that is 900,000 people. Now, what does that sound like? Well, that's just about the average of an IndyCar race on NBC in the year of 2024. So I would say my math kind of checks out on that. You could reduce it by another, 40 to 60% if it's on cable, but that's a whole nother discussion. When IndyCar is on network television, it's about 900,000. So what I'm saying is there's a couple of paths that I think IndyCar could take to increase their TV numbers, increase their interest. I think if IndyCar continues with the spec car idea, there's all this talk about them going to a spec engine as well. You're not going to get the hardcore racing fans to tune in for that the entire year. You're going to get hardcore IndyCar fans, and we've just established that there are enough of those to get you almost to 1 million. But I think that if you're going to continue with the spec car racing, you need to do more oval racing, and particularly more super speedway racing. Do whatever it takes to get to Michigan. Do whatever it takes to lease Kentucky or Chicagoland, or go back to Texas or Homestead. Find these racetracks where the cars will race a little bit more similarly to the Indianapolis 500 and pepper the schedule with, let's call them 500-mile races. I think it would be really cool. Almost like how IMSA does it with their endurance races. You kind of have the regular season races that fill out the calendar, but the ones everybody gets up and excited for are the endurance championship races. I think IndyCar would be wise to consider bringing back more than one 500-mile race and treating them all as crown jewel events. Hey, did you like the Indy 500? Well, check out the Michigan 500. Hey, did you like the Indy 500? Check out the Miami 500. Let's kick off the season in Miami with a 500-mile race. I think Nashville should be a 500-mile race. Let's use that a little bit more and use the word Grand Prix less. That's another thing that I think is a bit brand confusion, but that's not the point of this video. And if no new super speedways are added, if the Indy 500 is going to continue to be the only race that is like it, then it's time that IndyCar really starts to become more of its own thing. You know, there's a lot of spec open wheel series out there. I think IndyCar would be wise to consider a different chassis manufacturer, consider different power plants, maybe encouraging the manufacturers to go a different way. What if the Chevy was an 8-cylinder car, and what if the Honda was a 6-cylinder car? They would sound a little bit different. It would be a new, exciting thing for the hardcore and casual fans alike. Something like that, if the schedule is going to remain kind of this heavy majority, road and street course schedule, and very lacking on the super speedways, something technologically advanced can help significantly to kind of keep people's attention, the hardcore racing fans, and keep it away from other series that maybe scratch an itch better than that. The ideal scenario, if you could get them both, both the super speedways and the technology, you'd really be onto something. But again, we try to be realistic here, right? But I think if IndyCar engaged all of the hardcore racing fans that are out there, if they were truly must watch for everybody, the ceiling, I think, is like 1.5 million to 2 million people. And if you're talking about that every race, you're in a really sustainable spot and can ask quite a bit more money from the TV executives, right? They're currently in negotiations with TV right now. Who knows where it's going to go? I think I have an idea, but that'll be for another video. But I don't know. That's just my opinion. I just wanted to get this out there because I always see, and I'm seeing it right now on social media. You look at the IndyCar social media, and there's already people trolling them and saying, you got to promote Detroit, stop promoting the Indy 500. And I understand that sentiment, but I think they know where they are, and I don't blame them for continuing to squeeze as much juice out of the Indy 500 as they can, because that's where the attention is. That's where the attention lies. That's where the hardcore and softcore and casual racing fans all reside. And until they kind of can figure out how to attract more of those people to come in and watch the rest of the season, this is how things are going to be, unfortunately. But I hope this was constructive. I don't want this to be destructive, and I don't want to go into the whole thing I had to go into on December. I think everybody knows where I stand. I want to see this series succeed, but we also have to be realistic about where it is. And for the rest of the season, don't expect 6 million people, and be thankful if it's over 1 million with the TV number. But I think there are ways that IndyCar can get closer to where they want to be. It's just going to take a few more sprinkles of what makes the Indy 500 so magical. So thank you guys so much for watching. Coverage of Detroit is coming this weekend. Can't wait to be there, and we'll see you in the next video.